everyone. Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Eliza Nograti. I am a board member of Voice for Israel, and I'm very excited about our presentation this evening titled Troubling Signs of Anti-Semitism in Campus Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Initiatives. And I really want to thank our co-sponsors, Stand With Us, Hadassah of Raleigh-Cary, and Hadassah of Chapel Hill, Durham. And I'll introduce our speaker this evening. Dr. Jay Greene is a senior research fellow in the Center for Education Policy at the Heritage Foundation, where he conducts and disseminates research on key issues facing education today. He's one of the country's leading experts on education policy, authoring dozens of publications and writing or editing 4 books. Dr. Greene received his bachelor's in history from Tufts University, and I learned many other members of his family have as well, and his PhD in government from Harvard University. He'll be interviewed today by Marcia Harris, Voice for Israel Program Chair, about his recent report titled Inclusion Delusion, the Anti-Semitism of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Staff at Universities. We welcome your questions at the end of the presentation. Please use the Q&A box to enter them, and they'll be addressed at the end. And with that, I will turn it over to Marcia and Jay. Thanks.
Thank you, Eliza. And Dr. Greene, thank you so much for being with us tonight to discuss your very important report. Before we dive into the report, could you tell us a little bit about what DEI means and what the diversity, equity, and inclusion offices are? I know when I went to school, and probably for most of us on this call, there was no such animal. So we'd like to know a little bit more about it and how pervasive it is on college campuses.
Sure. So DEI stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And those are all good words, and they at least sound like good words. We might prefer equality instead of equity. There is a difference, but we could talk about that later. But they're the names really being given to a set of organizations that are on university campuses that are designed to promote certain political and social goals. And they actually had their origins as early as the 1970s. In multicultural centers was what they were called at the time. But they expanded over time. They included women's centers over time, and they included other ethnic groups as well. There would be a separate Hispanic center, sometimes an Asian American center. So there was an advocacy for an increasing number of centers to represent groups that were thought of as newly arriving on campus in large numbers and needing of some assistance in thriving in a university setting. Eventually, these groups got to be large enough that universities started to create chief diversity officers, a university-wide position to help coordinate the activities of all these different centers. And then those diversity offices in central administration grew as well in size, and they began to be imitated at college levels as well. So there are now chief diversity officers within each college within the university. And then sometimes there are diversity officers within departments within colleges. So this bureaucracy of staff, not faculty, who are there to promote certain social and political goals has grown quite large on university campuses over time.
So when you decided to undertake a study of the DEI administrators on campus, it sounds like it may have been hard to kind of find all of them because they're not all labeled DEI offices. Is that correct?
That's right. They go by many different names at many different universities, but James Paul and I did a systematic evaluation of the websites of 65 universities, which are the members of the Power 5 athletic conferences. We picked those universities because they're mostly large state universities and the kinds of places that people go to just because they live in a place, not because they're committed to a particular political vision. And many of them are public universities. There are a few privates as well, but most are state flagship universities. And when we did that study, we found that on average, these universities had 45 staff who we could identify as DEI officials. But it ranges. The University of Michigan actually has 132 that we could find. And this is a very conservative estimate. I should emphasize that we did not count any of the anti-discrimination legal compliance staff. Those people are there to prevent the university from being sued. And so the university has to have those people. We didn't count rape counseling staff who were in the women's centers. Again, we thought of those people more as health staff as opposed to political staff. So we did not count any of the faculty in ethnic studies or gender studies departments. We were only counting non-faculty staff who are not something universities have to have, but they wish to have. And they're there again to promote a particular political and social agenda.
So now let's talk about the study. I'm curious about why you decided to do this study. Did you have a hunch that you might find something troubling there?
So actually there was more than one study. The first study was simply to count how many DEI staff there were. And we found on average 45 of these people at these 65 universities, giving us almost 3,000 total people. And as we did that project, we documented who these people were, their names, their titles, and then it occurred to us after that some people said, well, 45 DEI staff, that's a good thing. Maybe it's a good thing that we have so many people there to promote diversity and equity and inclusion. Those sound like good words. Isn't it good that universities are promoting those good words? And our suspicion was that these people actually are not there to promote these good sounding words, that they're actually there promoting a relatively divisive and exclusionary ideology. And that it includes anti-Semitism as part of that. And so to test that idea, we searched for the Twitter accounts of these 3,000 DEI staff. And we found about 800 Twitter accounts for those 3,000 staff. Now, mind you, many people just don't have Twitter accounts, or they have Twitter accounts that don't have their names in them or go by some different name. Or our searches were imperfect and we didn't necessarily find everyone, but we found 800, of which 50 were protected accounts, so we could not observe their tweets. But 750 Twitter accounts we could find belonging to people who are DEI staff at universities. And these are not official accounts, these are their personal accounts. And the idea of looking at their social media accounts was to catch people in unguarded moments. So one of the great challenges with studying anti-Semitism is that we highly educated people are pretty sophisticated about this and have figured out ways of not saying that they're anti-Semitic. So if you ask them, do you hate Jews? They'll say, no, I don't. But the trick is to catch them unguarded, catch them when they don't know that you're asking them. And so looking at social media communications where they're sharing information voluntarily with the public is a way to catch them unaware and see a window into what they're thinking. It's an imperfect window, but it is a window into the kinds of things that they're thinking and talking about.
So did you choose a period of time? 750 Twitter accounts is a lot to look at.
Yeah.
And especially if somebody is very active with their Twitter accounts, there could be hundreds just from one individual. So how did you go about screening those?
Yeah. So what we had a program that allowed us to do keyword searches Now it's cumbersome, but we could do keyword searches of accounts, and it would allow us to examine as many as 3,200 tweets per account. So the time span covered varied because some people tweeted a lot, and 3,200 tweets represented a relatively short period of time. And for some people, their entire history on Twitter would not add up to 3,200 tweets. Also, some people have auto delete on their tweets so that after a certain period of time, their tweets delete. So there's a lot of messiness and imperfection in this. But again, it is a window into what people are thinking. So I could actually put up, if you don't mind, I can share our PowerPoint that will help show. There we go. What it is that we looked at. So, okay. So again, here's what we found in our first study, where we just counted up how many DEI staff there are. And you could see that there are about 45 per university that we looked at. And then we just wanted to put in perspective, how big is that? Like, is 45 a lot? Is that not a lot? So to put it in perspective, we counted also how many staff universities had to comply with the Americans for Disabilities Act, which is something they're required to do by law. And what we found is that on average, you have more than 4 times as many staff to promote the political and social agenda of DEI than you have people for complying with the Americans for Disabilities Act. So this is a fairly large commitment. Another way to put it in perspective is relative to the 100 faculty, which we also calculated. And lastly, we compared it to the number of history faculty on campus. And we picked history because we thought, well, history should tell all stories, all narratives of the world. And DEI is a particular narrative of the world. And you can see, again, on average, you have about 40% more, or 1.4 times, DEI staff as you have history faculty on these campuses. So this is a fairly large enterprise at these universities. And these are not, on average, the fanciest elite universities. So we're not looking at, Harvard and Brown and Stanford, while Stanford is included, but we're not a few of the fancy schools, but it's mostly state universities. Mm-hmm. You can, here, if I can advance, there we go. So you can see, for example, we also have an interactive data visualization. If people want to look it up, it's on the Heritage website. You can look up any of the 65 universities and see what the results are for each of those universities. Here I've screenshotted what the result is for the University of Michigan, which is the one with the largest DEI staff. There are 163 DEI staff at the University of Michigan. This actually was recently independently replicated in a great piece of reporting by the National Review, which actually looked at the trajectory of DEI staff over time to see how and when it grew and why it grew, and then a little in-depth analysis into what role they're really playing on campus and are they really promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion. The bottom line is they're mostly not. They're mostly, again, promoting a relatively narrow and divisive ideology. And so you can see it's really quite large. But since we're chatting here with folks mostly in North Carolina, I can also show you what it looks like at the University of North Carolina. And you can see it's a fairly large DEI staff there too. It's 53 DEI staff. It's the 18th largest of the 65 universities. Relative to ADA staff, however, it's the second largest. So there are over 13 times as many DEI staff at UNC as there are ADA staff. Although you have about as many history professors as you have DEI staff. You can also look at Duke. And it's a similar story. Duke has a smaller enrollment, but it's still quite large, even relative to its enrollment. and placing it as the 15th largest in the 65 universities we looked at.
So when you looked at these 745 tweets, I'm assuming you were searching for terms that would give you a clue about their feelings about Israel and,
sure.
and also China.
Right. So yes, so we searched these 700, almost 750 Twitter accounts for every time they mentioned certain keywords. And basically we just searched for the words Israel, Gaza, Palestine, which would catch Palestinian or Palestine. And then we also searched for the word China or Chinese. So this doesn't capture everything that they might have to say about Israel or about Jews, but it captures a certain slice of what they have to say. So every tweet, retweet, or like that mentioned those key terms. And what we found was three important things. One is that they're relatively obsessed with Israel. So that is, they tweet a lot more about Israel than they do about China. Now, this is strange because Israel is a very small country and China is a very large one. It's not as if China hasn't been in the news lately. It has, been quite prominent. And also, given that there was a pandemic that originated there, you might think that they would particularly pay attention to China, but no, they're spending almost 3 times as much attention on Israel as China. And here you can kind of see the relative amount of attention. So much more tweeting about Israel than China, but also you could see that we coded the direction of the sentiment that was being expressed about Israel or about China. And we were just looking at China for comparison purposes, just to kind of adjust for, is this amount of attention on Israel a lot or a little? And is this criticism of Israel, typical of criticism of other countries? And what we found is that 96% of the tweets about Israel were critical, while 62% of the tweets about China were favorable. So this grossly disproportionate attention to Israel and criticism of Israel it begins to represent a pattern of anti-Semitism, right? So there's nothing inherently anti-Semitic in criticizing Israel, but if you're inordinately attending to Israel and disproportionately criticizing Israel, then it begins to raise concerns that what we're seeing here is actually evidence of anti-Semitism. But it's not just the disproportionate attention and disproportionate criticism, but also the vitriolic language that was often used. So, for example, words like apartheid, colonial, targeting children, genocide, ethnic cleansing, these were terms that were used, fairly frequently with respect to Israel and almost never with respect to China. This hyperbolic language would be further indications of anti-Semitism and not merely legitimate criticism of Israel or concern about human rights.
I believe you said in your report that out of the 745 tweets that you investigated,
or Twitter accounts,
Twitter accounts, there were 633, I think, that were critical of Israel. So
633 tweets, right?
Tweets,
so it's
tweets,
right.
Exactly.
Right.
So how many individuals does that represent? Is it 10 people that are tweeting obsessively 63 times each?
Right.
Or
no,
is
so
individuals.
So we used the tweets as the count, but and we did that again because this is it's as if we're sampling all their thoughts. Now it's if it were the case though that this all came from 10 people, that would be problematic. But actually, it comes from about 400 different people, if I remember right. So there are some people who are high volume tweeters on this topic, but other people where it's actually just 1 or 2. So we're not observing that everyone is tweeting critically, but we are finding a lot of critical tweets, and it's across a very large number of people and not concentrated in a small number of high volume tweeters.
Now, I'm assuming it was intentional that your report doesn't name names, does not even name universities. Could you tell us a little bit about your thinking?
Sure. So look, it's not our intention to cancel any individual. We think that's bad practice in general, and it discourages honest intellectual exchange. We're not concerned with any individuals here. What we're concerned with is a system, a pattern of universities investing very heavily in an infrastructure that is promoting hostility towards Israel and hostility towards Jews. And I don't think that these universities are aware that that is what they're doing. I think they think they're doing something good, because the words diversity, equity, and inclusion are good words, and they want to promote those good things. But the people who are in this effort to that staff DEI efforts are have a particular ideology, and they're reproducing their ideology, and their ideology is essentially divides the world into two big categories. There are the oppressor and the oppressed. There are the privileged and the disadvantaged, and then they just place people into these categories of oppressor or oppressed. And equity and justice demand that the two groups be treated differently. That is, the privileged deserve to have their privilege taken away, and the oppressed deserve restitution for the wrongs that have been done to them. And this worldview is a worldview that is really antithetical to kind of longstanding American political values. American political values, while we've always imperfectly realized them and have fallen short for much of our history, our ideals have been equal treatment under the law, and to treat individuals and not groups. But to place people in groups and then to place those groups into categories of oppressed and oppressor is ultimately what leads to the worldview of the DEI staff. And inevitably what happens is that Jews get put into the group of the oppressor. And once that happens, then the harsh treatment that Jews receive becomes legitimate. They deserve it, would be the argument. They're privileged and deserve to have their privilege taken away. And so that's, I think, the kind of intellectual or ideological orientation of these DEI efforts, which undermine the kind of noble sounding purposes of their offices.
So you said that one of the main purposes of your study is to make universities aware of what is happening on the campuses. I know I've seen your report cited in the Jewish press. I'm not sure I've seen it cited anywhere else. So has it been sent to campuses? Have you done anything to try to get this to university presidents and chancellors? Yes,
I mean, so the best way to reach universities is actually through their main supporters. So that includes their alumni, their large donors, the parents of students who are attending, the people who often pay the tuition for those children, and then also for the state legislators who govern these universities when they're public institutions. And we're reaching out to all of those organizations. Reaching out to the administration directly, has limited use because, in my experience, administration tends to be responsive to pressure from powerful constituents, and it's less of a debate society where they're not interested in arguing about the merits of ideas, but they are fearful of powerful groups that might infringe upon them. And I think it's that fear of powerful groups that make them cater excessively to these DEI ideology. So it's necessary to have a kind of counter pressure, a counter organized set of groups. And talking to a group like yours is a way of doing that. But I've written numerous op-eds. I've spoken to numerous groups, and honestly, I also work for an organization, the Heritage Foundation, that is not kind of known as a Jewish organization. It's not a particularly heavily Jewish organization. And so, it's a way to reach a lot of non-Jewish audiences through them. They're very effective at reaching out to non-Jewish audiences. And frankly, I think that it's important, if Jews are going to be successful in fighting anti-Semitism, we need allies. We're not big enough. We're not large enough on our own. There are too few of us. We're only 2%. And so if we can find allies who have similar concerns, who share similar interests, we can form coalitions that are large enough to help combat anti-Semitism and achieve some common goals. And I think Heritage Foundation has been very effective at doing that. But I think trying to communicate directly to universities has not been particularly productive yet. But beginning to talk through their donors, alumni, and state legislators, it begins to get their attention.
So I know campuses always have this tension between academic freedom and freedom of speech versus hate speech, bias. I'm going to ask you to put on your education policy consultant hat, because I know in addition to being a researcher, you're a policy consultant. Do you feel that universities should vet DEI administrators before hiring them in terms of looking at their personal social media? And if they haven't vetted them beforehand, once they are on board and they have tweets like this, do you think that they should be fired?
So no. I'm a longstanding academic as well. Before joining Heritage Foundation just this last year, I was distinguished professor of education policy at the University of Arkansas for the last 16 years. And I've also been a professor at University of Texas and University of Houston as well. So I've been in academia for a long time. And I think it's antithetical to university missions to impose speech codes in any direction. And that's not the purpose of this project. The purpose of this project is to make universities aware that there's an ideological problem with these offices they've created. They've essentially created a political commissariat. Okay, so in the Soviet Union, there were officers that were attached to every factory or every military unit who were there to ensure ideological compliance with the Soviet Union. That was their purpose. They were political commissariat. And the DEI staff is playing essentially the same role at universities. Their role is to articulate and enforce an ideological orthodoxy on campus. And that is also antithetical to the true mission of academia. And so really what I'd like to see universities do is dismantle this DEI infrastructure. I mean, it's not appropriate actually to have at universities. I think it is perfectly appropriate to be welcoming to people from many different backgrounds and make people feel comfortable on campus. And I think that is an appropriate activity of universities. But the DEI infrastructure has long since gone beyond that role. That is no longer, that may have been their role 30 years ago, but it is not even close to their main mission now. And so these departments, these offices really need to be largely eliminated or shrunk down to staying out of essentially political orthodoxy and getting back into simply kind of student life and helping people navigate unfamiliar cultural settings or to help navigate cultural clashes that may occur on campus. That sort of thing is perfectly reasonable and doesn't require a lot of people either. So that I think is the realistic goal here. And it is realistic. I mean, it may sound like pie in the sky to get rid of DEI staff, but honestly, you know, no one, once they see what these offices are really up to, I don't think a lot of people really like it. This is not popular on campus. Faculty don't like it. Students don't like it. No one likes to be told what is okay for them to say, think, or do. Parents don't like it. State legislators don't like it. I think it's just a matter of people beginning to figure out that there's something going on in campus that is really hostile to their interests. Again, forming coalitions, and I think these things will begin to shrink pretty dramatically.
So when it comes specifically to Jewish students, do you think there's a double standard? You talked in your report about a recent book called Jews Don't Count. And I have to say, it's hard for me to think that some of this language and behavior would be tolerated if it were anti-gay or if it were racist by a DEI officer. So what are your thoughts on that?
Right. I mean, universities are under two irreconcilable commands. One is they must not infringe on free speech, and the other is they must not facilitate discrimination. Now, as it turns out, some speech will be discriminatory or perceived as discriminatory by at least some people. And so how are universities supposed to navigate this? This is very, very challenging for them. And I'm sympathetic to this challenge. What I would like them to do, and I think it's reasonable to expect them to do, is to be consistent. They clearly apply a double standard with respect to Jews and tolerate speech about Jews that they wouldn't tolerate with respect to other groups, as you point out. I think the equilibrium that would be ideal for us to reach is for actually greater tolerance of speech across the board for all groups. So that means that there will still be people saying bad things about Jews, about Israel, and I think we are going to have to live with that. And I think it'll be easier to live with that if every other group has to live with it too. And then we'll feel emboldened to speak back and express our own views without fear on campus. And I think in a neutral battle of ideas, I think the pro-Zionist ideas are better. And I think that we have a good chance to advance them if we can be on a level playing field.
Great. On that note, I'm going to end my questioning and I'm going to turn the program over to Dr. Mike Ross, who will take questions from the attendees.
Thank you, Marcia, and thank you, Jay. This has been very, very interesting. I have a question here. Can you talk a little bit about who are the drivers behind the DEI movement on campus? I mean, how did they get started? How are they empowered? How do they interrelate to the other power structures, so to speak, on campus, the students, the faculty and administrators?
Sure. So the kind of rough history of this is that it was largely as African-American students were arriving on campus in larger numbers in the 70s and 80s. Some universities believed that it was necessary to create institutions to help assimilate those students into the norms of academia, the norms of higher education. And now it's a little bit strange because there had been many newly arriving groups on campus before then, where there were not groups created by the universities themselves to assimilate. And so in some ways it was a little bit of a patronizing attitude with respect to those African-American students, but these institutions were created, but they were there to assimilate newly arriving African-American populations on campus into the norms and ways of academia. Over time, this began to flip, where rather than trying to get the newly arriving students to understand how things worked on campus, they began to think that the way to make things work better would be to change the campus instead of changing the students, right? Instead of helping students become comfortable with and familiar with how things are done in academia. We should change academia to be more comfortable to the students. And so also what happened is that every time some incident occurred on campus or off campus, there'd be political agitation by a small group of students, a small group of faculty, and administrators are incredibly risk-averse people and very ambitious. And so they don't want trouble. So they would, at relatively low cost themselves, pledge to expand DEI efforts to demonstrate their commitment in response to some negative incident on or off campus. And so this is a one-way ratchet that just kept growing the DEI infrastructure. The other thing that began to happen is as the DEI infrastructure got much bigger, it began to be the organizer of the agitation whenever an incident occurred to demand for yet more DEI. So it's essentially a shakedown, right? That begins to ratchet up over time. Now, how it is that, I mean, the truth is the average faculty member is a left of center person, but is not a radical, not a Marxist. You know, people have stereotypes about what universities look like. They don't look radical. They look, you know, moderately liberal. And most of these moderately liberal faculty don't want to live in fear that they're going to be reported to DEI staff for having said or done a wrong thing or having written a wrong thing. They don't want that. They want to be left alone to teach their classes and do their research as they think best. And so they're not very happy about this. In addition, the average student doesn't like it either. They don't want to live in fear of this either. Again, so it's a very well-organized minority of students and faculty, largely organized by the DEI staff itself, that has increased the power of this effort, which is why if a counter organization could come along, I don't think these things would stand up very well.
Very interesting. So, and how are they funded? Somebody asked, like, where, and is that a sizable chunk of resources for a university?
So you all are paying for this, and you're paying for it in lots of different ways. You're paying for it when you pay tuition for your kids or for yourself. You're paying for it when you pay taxes, because these are publicly supported institutions. Even if they're private universities, they receive a very large public subsidy. And you're paying for it when you donate money, which you might want to reconsider doing until these things get under control. So you're paying for it in all these ways. Now, as to how large this is, I mean, in truth, the size of university budgets is so big that even a staff of 45 people and kind of other kind of operating expenses they have doesn't actually add up to that much. So this is not why universities are so expensive. The reason why universities are so expensive is that this is how they handle every issue, right? They kind of create bloated bureaucracy to address everything that might pose a political challenge for administrators' careers, right? So they'll throw money at lots of things. And the other thing is that no matter what university people tell you, they're awash in money. I mean, there's huge amounts of money in higher ed. So it makes it so this is not a very large percentage, but it is, but it's a lot of money still. And you're basically paying for people to teach your kids to hate Israel and to have negative feelings about Jews. This is a very bad thing, and you should probably try to figure out how to stop it.
Yeah. Well, that there's another question, and I think our audience are mostly, well, they're almost all alumni of somewhere, I imagine, and many of us are parents. Many of us are other stakeholders at universities, and people want to know what they can do. That's not an easy thing to answer, I imagine. But.
Well, no, so I think the practical steps are, if you are an active alum of a university, a donor, you should withhold your donations and communicate to the development staff at the university why you're withholding it. Get your message across. In addition, you should contact your state representative and senator and say, look, you're a taxpayer in North Carolina, and you want to understand why your taxes are going to UNC for this purpose. And honestly, state legislatures, they have, I mean, sometimes they like it a little bit too much, but they like beating up on universities. And so if you give them this issue, they will take you up on it if you feed this issue to your state representative, your state senator. So that's another thing to do. And then I think the other thing to do is that there are a lot of really excellent organizations like Voices for Israel that are also themselves directly advocating on these kinds of issues. And so you should get involved in organizations like this one. But there are lots of, I mean, Stand With Us, and there are tons of other very effective pro-Zionist organizations out there that I think you can become active in that will also help advance this cause.
So have you gotten any response from the DEI infrastructure specifically? I mean, anybody from departments who have noticed this and commented on it at all?
So directly from the universities, no. Look, they're when you're winning, your inclination is not to respond to criticism, because why should you? All you could do is lose when you respond. So they've tried to put it on ignore. Now, in certain places, the pressure has gotten intense, and they've had to begin to issue statements. And there's begun to be some fairly hostile coverage, particularly of the University of Michigan. And so they're having to issue statements now. And what they do is they just resort to saying, well, diversity is a very good goal. That's very important to us. And again, I want to make clear that diversity is a good goal. And the concerns I'm expressing here are not concerns about diversity. It's actually concerns about what's being done that's bad in the name of a good thing like diversity.
I have a question that's specific to a university. It happens to be Rutgers as one of the Big Ten school, but I want to ask you, I mean, you didn't really look for patterns of specific universities being worse than others in this study, did you?
We did not. Here, and I just pulled up in the Heritage data visualization, I just pulled up Rutgers. Rutgers has 53 DEI personnel, is the 18th largest in terms of DEI personnel. Just in case your Rutgers alum would like to know. But we did not. I mean, look, you can't slice this too finely because we start with 3,000 people, then we get down to 750 Twitter accounts. They're spread across 65 universities. You begin not to really have a large enough sample per university to say something. And it's not that there isn't more going on at these universities that is anti-Semitic. It's just that our window into what's going on is a limited window, and we can't slice that limited window too finely to mix metaphors. So that's why we're not in a position to say, oh yeah, the tweets from Rutgers, those were really bad ones, because our tweets were kind of spread across. But look, I mean, it's not as if it varied. It's not as if there was some good place, right? I mean, 96% of the tweets were critical. There were almost no positive tweets about Israel from DEI staff anywhere. So you can safely assume that it's also true of whatever your university is too.
Here's a question. You did this study to sort of confirm a hypothesis that there was what gave you, I mean, the suggestion that there was anti-Semitism among DEI initiatives?
So, I mean, there had been some high-profile anecdotes, news events reported. So, for example, the chief diversity officer at Google, it was revealed that he had written a blog post that said that Jews liked war too much, liked killing too much to defend themselves, something along those lines. And he made this slip of saying Jews, not Israel. If only he had said Israel, he might have gotten away with it. But he said Jews instead. And this was the head of diversity at one of the largest companies in the world. I mean, a company that's very sensitive to all other forms of discrimination. But the guy who's in, like, the fox in charge of the chicken coop, you know, was saying clearly anti-Semitic things. Interestingly, the consequence for him individually was not that he was fired. He was not fired. His consequence was that he was reassigned to be in their education efforts. I don't understand why that is, but that's where he is. And so there had been a number of incidents like this. And so this had helped contribute to my impression that this was a fairly common pattern. But you know, the plural of anecdote isn't necessarily data. So, you know, we wanted to try to count this systematically to see if the pattern we observed systematically was consistent with these anecdotes of news reports that we were receiving. And that's in fact exactly what we found.
And another question, are you doing any follow-up studies or any other studies after this prompted by your initial results?
So yes, so we are thinking about looking into chief diversity officers in K-12 schools. So this kind of DEI infrastructure is also now being reproduced in the K-12 system as well. And so we're thinking about trying to reproduce it there. These are very labor intensive and difficult studies to pull off. And like I said, you know, every study is imperfect, you know, so you should, I'll take my own research with a grain of salt. You should too. But, you know, as the studies begin to pile up where they point in the same direction, you begin to believe them. And so I think it'll be useful to see if we can replicate this same kind of thing in the different educational space. So that's kind of one thing that we're looking into doing. Now we're also interested in university statements that are issued following bad things. So in particular, following the George Floyd murder and trial of his murderer and the conviction of that man, universities very often issued statements, for example. There were some universities that issued statements following the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting, as well as the Chabad shooting out in San Diego. Sometimes they did that, not as often. So one thing would be to look at how often they are offering communications about different kinds of incidents. But the other thing is to compare the statements themselves. And our suspicion, we haven't done this yet, but our hypothesis is that the statements in response to George Floyd incidents are framed as Black Lives Matter statements. That is, that they specifically denounce anti-Black racism and express concern about justice for Blacks. But that the Jewish incidents, we suspect, are more likely framed as all lives matter. That is, to denounce hatred in all forms and to and not to go out of their way to mention other groups that deserve justice and not simply Jews. And again, there are kind of anecdotes of news that give us motivation for this. In particular, there's the head of a literary organization, the DEI officer at a literary organization, who actually lost her job because she issued a statement after an attack against Jews, because the statement failed to mention justice for Palestinians. So in other words, the double standard is that Jews are given the all lives matter treatment and Blacks are given the Black Lives Matter treatment. And again, what I think would be appropriate is for consistent response, right? And I think Jews should insist on being treated the same as others, not differently.
So this is not a question, but it's a follow-up that
Sure.
I mean, there is a certain amount of subjectivity
Right.
in what you have to do. And that's, I say that not meant as criticism, but as commiseration, that it's tricky when you have to be.
Right. So we'll have to come up, so when you quantify things in a study, then you have to take kind of subjective things and then develop rules, procedures to turn those subjective judgments into numbers. And then there are ways to check yourself on this too. So there's a thing called intercoder reliability, where you have different people independently do the process of turning the judgments into numbers, and you see if you do it the same way. And so there are ways of trying to check yourself to make sure that your hypothesis does not lead you into a conclusion if the data don't really support it.
So somebody asks, has this been in the lay press, so to speak? What coverage has it gotten?
So yes, it has. It was in Newsweek. It was in Michigan, Detroit News, more conservative media. So Free Beacon, Washington Free Examiner. Then obviously a lot of Jewish and pro-Israel news coverage as well. But it has gotten coverage, and it's also hasn't gone away. Like the interest in this study has not diminished at all since it was released, because I think it helps document for people something they suspect is true. So there is an enduring interest in invoking this research, because I think it helps support people when they're trying to articulate something that they think is true.
So somebody asks, what has been the response from Jewish, they didn't say this, but legacy organizations? Have they taken note of this?
They have not. So if by legacy organization we mean like Anti-Defamation League, no. But I think this is a problem that the Jewish community is having to face up to, which is that we've created a set of institutions over time, and as our needs change, then sometimes the institutions we need also change. And some of those institutions can adapt and follow the community's needs as they change, and others don't adapt, in part because they don't have to, because they find other ways of kind of making a living that don't require keeping up with the changing needs of the Jewish community.
So I think that's about it. Last chance. Anybody have a question?
Well, can I plug one other thing?
Sure. I was going to plug something for Voice for Israel, but no. Yeah.
Well, so one other study that I have done is on the relationship between education levels and anti-Semitism.
Oh, yeah.
And in fact, you can find this in Tablet magazine, but it's also coming out in a peer-reviewed journal as well, but a lay accessible version. And I can even drop it in the chat. I don't know if that's if I can share with everyone.
No, I don't think it gets shared, but
it doesn't. But if you look up Tablet magazine, so the point of this study is that.
By the way, I can include it we can include it in the follow-up email people will send. Yeah,
sure. So there's a long-standing belief that higher education levels are associated with reduced anti-Semitism, that anti-Semitism is concentrated among people with low education levels. And the theory that we have is that anti-Semitism is a function of ignorance. People don't know. And that the solution then to ignorance is education. So the way we combat anti-Semitism is with education. Unfortunately, I don't think that's true. And the problem is in the way we measure anti-Semitism. So largely we measure it by asking people, how do you feel about Jews? And we do this, we say like, here's a statement, how much do you agree with it? And the statement is something like Jews cause wars or Jews control international banking. And the more you agree with those statements, the more anti-Semitic you're thought to be. And the problem with measuring anti-Semitism in this way is that highly educated people know what you're asking, and they're sophisticated enough to give an answer that's socially acceptable, but not necessarily candid, which is, again, why it's so important to catch people unaware if you want to measure anti-Semitism. And so the way we did it, the way we caught people unaware in this study that's in Tablet, is that we actually randomized 2 different versions of a question. So people would only see one version or another. No one saw both. And we'd ask them to apply a principle either to Jews or to non-Jews. Same principle. They should answer it the same on average if people don't have any animosity towards Jews. So we'd ask things like, should the military be allowed to restrict religious headgear? And either the example is a kippah or a Sikh's turban, okay? The answer should be the same. The principle is the same. But on average, as you move up in education level, the answers are different. People with higher education levels answer it much more harshly with respect to Jews than they do Sikhs. And we asked this over a variety of different double standard questions. Again, no one knew they were being asked how they felt about Jews relative to another group because no one saw both versions. They would only see one version or the other. But we could compare the averages across within education levels. And so people with higher education levels are actually significantly more anti-Semitic. And this means that our problem is not one of ignorance, but is of political interest, right? Yeah. People have a political interest. They get a benefit somehow out of sticking it to Jews. And we have to figure out how to counter that political problem. And merely, increasing Holocaust education efforts will not solve this. Although, I'm all for that, but that's not the nature of our problem. And I mention this only because, again, it's consistent with this DEI study that what we have here is a political ideological problem. People have a belief system that benefits them that involves hating Jews. And to get them out of that belief system, it's not because they're dumb or poorly educated. They're not. I mean, the DEI staff we're looking at, many of them have PhDs, right? They're highly educated people. The problem is that they benefit somehow from believing what they do. And we have to figure out how to counter that by organizing and making it so that it's not appealing to people to buy into that belief system, to buy into that ideology. So just a thought for kind of how we should be thinking about the nature of our challenge and what the nature of the solution looks like.
It is a big challenge, I think, but people are not here to listen to what I think. So I just want to say, Voice for Israel, we have an upcoming program. We have a live program in coordination with the Jewish Federation of Raleigh-Cary and Jewish for Good and the Israel Center in Durham Chapel Hill. We're bringing in a popular rock singer from Israel for Yom HaAtzmaut named Rami Feinstein. And it's on May 14th, and you'll all get an email about it shortly. So be on the lookout for it. I really want to thank you. This was terrific.
Look, I've enjoyed chatting with you, and I'm glad people were able to join to listen in, and feel free to reach out to me directly at the Heritage Foundation. Always happy to get your emails and your thoughts. And look, I mean, again, we have to work together to figure out ways of advancing Zionism and the interests of Jews, and that's a high priority for me, and I know it is for all of you since you're here this evening.
Well, thank you very much. I want to remind people that we're recording this and we'll send it out so you can share it with people who weren't able to attend. And that concludes our program. Thank you very much.